The book, Hitler's American Gamble, recounts the 5 days that upended everything. Those days include December 7th through December the 11th, 1941, from Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor to Hitler's declaration of war on the United States. Tracing developments in real time, British historians Brendan Sims and Charlie Laderman reveal how America's engagement was in fact far from inevitable. Professors Sims and Laderman quote the late Churchill biographer Martin Gilbert as saying Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States was, quote, arguably his single greatest mistake of the war, unquote. Professor Charlie Laderman, when did you start thinking about this particular book, Hitler's American Gamble?
Well, we started thinking about the book when we were teaching a class together. So Brendan and I used to teach a class together at Cambridge's International Relations Department. And after class one day, we were talking about that very tight but excruciatingly uncertain period between Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war on the United States. And we thought, well, what must it have been like to have been sitting in the White House, to have been sitting in 10 Downing Street, waiting to know what might happen from Hitler's Germany, how he might respond. And our sense was that this was a period of real uncertainty and a period where so much was up in the air. And so we decided after that conversation, after class, to sort of dig into this and decide, well, is what was actually going on and how can we try and recreate that? And it came from there. It came from teaching together.
Brendan Sims, why did the Japanese attack the United States on December the 7th, 1941?
Well, I think there's two reasons, a deep and long-term reason and an approximate reason. The deep long-term reason is that the Japanese Empire had ambitions in East Asia, which were hegemonic and which were not compatible, particularly with regard to China, but also other parts of the region, which were not compatible with US interests. And the United States was pushing back. And the Japanese were, in a sense, in a kind of a fundamental clash with America on this. And the proximate reason is that the Japanese leadership felt that while on the one hand, their time had come to realize their ambitions, they felt running out of time for the simple reason that the Roosevelt administration had imposed in the sort of summer of 1941 serious embargoes on Japan to do with oil and scrap metal, which were slowly, from the point of view of the Japanese leadership, strangling the empire. And finally, then the Secretary of State had also issued what they called an ultimatum, basically demanding the Japanese step down from their ambitions in East Asia. So from their point of view, they were being boxed into a corner and they felt they had to act.
Professor Laderman, learn anything new about Hitler?
Well, I think one of the things that we try to look at in relation to Hitler is his ideas stretching back over a longer period. And we draw on quite a bit of the material that Professor Sims drew on for his Hitler biography published recently. And one of the things that was fascinating to us was some of these ideas that Hitler had formed around the time of the First World War and into the 1920s, and the place of the United States in his ideology. And I think for a long time it was considered that Hitler saw the United States as this sort of decadent power that really wasn't really a nation that he had to take much consideration of. I think what we try to show in the book is that Hitler actually had some very deep-seated ideas about the United States, and he saw it as it was the most powerful industrial nation in the world, and that Germany needed to build up its own strength in order to be able to compete in a world where the United States would be the dominant power. And that conception of the United States was a major part of it. So there was the sort of geopolitical sense, but there was also the demographic sense, the way in which Germans had left the Germany in the late 19th, early 20th century moved to the United States, and Hitler's concern was that they had strengthened the United States, which he saw as this not just a geopolitical power, but also a racial power that had combined the stock of Anglo-Saxons with Germanic peoples. And his concern was to carve out an area in Europe where that emigration from Germany to the United States wouldn't continue to occur, and that he would strengthen Germany's position. So we were particularly interested in the way in which he saw the United States and the way in which that played into the decision-making that he took in December 1941.
Brendan Sims, did I read correctly in your book that by December the 7th, 1941, the Germans had killed 1 million Russian Jews already?
That is, broadly speaking, correct. I mean, the figure is an approximation, but the mass murder of the Jews, there had already, of course, been many Jews killed beforehand, particularly in Poland, but the systematic murder of European Jewry really began with the so-called Einsatzgruppen in the summer of 1941, the autumn of 1941, where probably about 1 million Soviet Jews had been murdered through the use of bullets. So that's a very different form of killing, of course, than gas chambers. So Soviet Jewry, by and large, has been eliminated by December 1941. So the Jews we're talking about that are now in contention are really the Jews of Central and particularly Western Europe, who loom more and more large in Hitler's mind, because he connects them, wrongly of course, but we're trying to get into his conception. He connects European Jewry with the United States, with the power of international capitalism. And he views them, and he says this quite explicitly, as a kind of hostage for the good behavior of President Roosevelt.
One of the most interesting things to me that I did not know, and I'm not a historian, but in reading about this over the years, did not know, something called the Victory Plan. And General Albert Wiedemeyer and the Chicago Tribune, either one of you explain that, what it was, and what impact it had on those days you write about?
Yes, of course, I'd be very happy to speak about that. So what happens with the Victory Program is that in 1941, the United States is moving closer to antagonism and potential belligerency with Germany. There's the unrestricted there's the undeclared submarine warfare in the Atlantic. There's the Atlantic Charter meeting with Winston Churchill, and there's the Lend-Lease provisions that are going to Britain and latterly to the Soviet Union as well. And over this period, as the United States is sort of moving towards a position of potentially outright belligerency, the United States and the Roosevelt administration decide to put in place certain plans for what they would need to do in order to defeat not just Nazi Germany, but also potentially Imperial Japan as well. And Wedemeyer oversees this Victory Program, this planning for what would be required for the United States to win that war. And it's a complex document, because when it makes certain plans for what the United States would need to do, there's also the sense that underlays it that the United States can continue to supply the British and the Soviets, and that might be the best way for the United States to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, not to enter itself in terms of full-scale military intervention. And that document, though, is leaked in the days leading up to Pearl Harbor in early December 1941. It's leaked to the press. It's, as you say, it's published in the Chicago Tribune, and there's a huge outpouring of outrage from America Firsters and those who were saying, well, Roosevelt might have been saying in public he was trying to avoid the United States getting into war, but in private he's planning for an intervention in this conflict. And so that's, in the American press, it's all around the world as well. And there's a sense there that the United States, because the Victory Program talks about a potential American expeditionary force to Europe, millions of American soldiers serving in Europe again. And this is at a time where, as we say, there might be sort of undeclared naval warfare in the Atlantic, but the United States is not a belligerent in the conflict.
Because we still deal a lot with stories that are leaked from inside the government, going through the process here, and I'll use your pronunciation on General, he ended up being a General Whittemar. He was a major at the time who wrote this victory plan, but it was eventually leaked to Burton Wheeler, a Democrat, a senator from Montana, who was a progressive left of center. But he then leaked it to Robert McCormick's newspaper, the Tribune. McCormick was a conservative, but he was an isolationist. And I would ask Brendan Sims about isolationism in the Midwest and what you all learned about that and the impact it had on FDR as he was approaching this situation and, of course, the attack on December 7th.
Well, it's a hugely constraining factor for FDR. Because it's no secret, really, that he was seeking not necessarily to bring the United States into the war directly, but certainly to defeat Hitler. And that rubbed up against these very strong views on the America First isolationist side, which basically argued that entry by the US into the First World War had been a mistake. It had been something undertaken really at the behest of the British, to the manipulation of the press by the British, so the argument went, following the interests of capitalists, really not something that was in tune with the true spirit of the American people. Now, Roosevelt, of course, doesn't agree with that. He thinks that view is naive, but he's also realistic enough to realize that if he enters the war of his own accord, he will bring the United States in as a divided country. And so what he's trying to do is to maneuver as much as possible in such a way as to ensure that the United States will not be the aggressor, that the isolationists will be shown up to be naive. And the problem really with the attack on Pearl Harbor is that it only solves part of his problem. In some ways, it creates a new one. So his main concern, as we've said, is with Hitler. And yet on the 7th of December, he has a conflict with Japan and not with the German Reich. And so in some ways, he's exactly in the place he doesn't want to be, which is that he's fighting a war that people have warned him against. But at the same time, he's not actually fighting the war he wants to fight. So he still has a problem, in other words, with isolationists after Pearl Harbor. It's very much not the case, as you'll often read, that isolationism simply disappears on December the 7th. It still lives on another few days.
Charlie Laderman, you're a professor. Tell us where are you today, and where did you get your education?
So I'm currently at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, where I'm spending the academic year, but I spend the majority of my time at King's College London in the War Studies Department, which is my home institution. And prior to that, I took my PhD at the University of Cambridge. I've also studied at Yale University and the University of Nottingham. But yes, King's College London is my main home base at the moment. Before I go to Professor Sims, what's the reaction in the classroom when you start teaching this? So I think what we try to do is to recreate the sort of the contingency, this uncertainty of trying to get students to get into the mindset of actors at the time, because I think it's when we look back on history, there seems to be a sense of inevitability, certainly of something like the Second World War, where the United States is so powerful and the ultimate defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan is so overwhelming that it seems inevitable that was going to happen. And what we try to do is get students to put themselves back in times of uncertainty, times where the sort of counterfactuals that we might look back on now were very real possibilities to those at the time. So as Brendan has said, one of the things that's really important to us is to put ourselves in the position of President Roosevelt, his administration, where you have 75 to 80% of the population, according to public opinion polls in the days leading up to Pearl Harbor, not believing that the United States should recognize the existence of a state of war with Germany. And he feels very constrained by this public opinion. And then the attack by Japan on Pearl Harbor and the attacks across East Asia, in some senses, simplify some matters by bringing the United States into the war. It means that Japan is not going to be attacking Britain on its own, and Roosevelt is able to bring the United States into that war in East Asia because he does see Japan as a great threat. But in many other ways, it causes huge problems, that Nazi Germany is seen as the greater threat, but Roosevelt feels that he can't preempt Adolf Hitler by a declaration of war because of the constraints domestically. And so the questions become about how you respond to that, and big questions about what sort of supplies, lend-lease supplies, will be provided to those nations fighting Germany, and what supplies will be kept for America's own armed forces for its new war in the Pacific. So the idea, and I think students find this very interesting to do, is to say, okay, how can we think strategically? How can we think as an actor at the time? What sort of decisions would I have made? How would I have dealt with this extremely complex situation? And that's sort of the heart of what I believe Brendan Sims does as well in his teaching.
Brendan Sims, where are you today, and what is your background? And I've asked you the same question about your students.
So I'm sitting in my room in Peterhouse, which is the oldest college of the University of Cambridge. I grew up in the Republic of Ireland. I'm a Dubliner, and I did my first degree at Trinity College Dublin. Then I came here to Cambridge to do my PhD. I took a few years out from time to time to go to German universities, University of Tübingen and University of Mainz. So I spend a lot of time in Germany. And with respect to how students react, I think in addition to all the factors that Charlie has mentioned, one thing that comes across to them very clearly is the danger of teleology. In other words, reading back into history from our own vantage point, from knowing in retrospect how things turned out. Because we know that Hitler declared war on the United States on the 11th of December 1941, and therefore, for all the reasons we've given, let Roosevelt off the hook. Because we know that, we tend to assume that that was always going to happen in that way, or at least that the other protagonists knew that that would happen. And so we lose this sense of what George Kennan called excruciating uncertainty between the 7th of December and the 11th of December. We lose that sense of contingency. So I think what students appreciate particularly about our book, but also about this general way of approaching history, is that it restores the sense of drama, the sense of contingency, that things didn't have to turn out the way they did, and that, of course, the protagonists are always operating within a much more limited range of information than that which is available to us, the historians.
Anybody that's interested can go online and listen to all of the FDR fireside chats. There are about 30 of them. You mentioned one in your book on December the 9th. And we're going to run just a minute excerpt of this because you say that instead of talking about Japan the whole time after the December 7th attack, he often talks about Germany. Here's FDR.
Remember always that Germany and Italy, regardless of any formal declaration of war, consider themselves at war with the United States at this moment, just as much as they consider themselves at war with Britain or Russia. And Germany puts all the other republics of the Americas into the same category of enemies. The people of our sister republics of this hemisphere can be honored by that fact.
Professor Laderman, what were you hearing there?
I think this is a real escalation in the rhetorical combat that has occurred between President Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler from around 1937, where Roosevelt first puts Hitler's Germany alongside Mussolini's Italy and Imperial Japan in his famous quarantine speech of these dangers to the international order. And so Roosevelt really escalates the rhetoric, the sense that the United States is essentially already in a state of war with Germany. But I think what's fascinating about that is that in the aftermath of it and in the speech itself, Roosevelt doesn't ask Congress to call for a declaration of a state of war, because he knows, as we've said, the challenges that he faces with that domestically. And so while this speech sets out the challenge and the threat posed by Nazi Germany. To a certain extent, even though Roosevelt knows that Hitler's Germany is the greater threat, he does not want, and he cannot conceive of a war that the United States will fight only against Imperial Japan. He knows that for domestic political reasons, a lot of his problems will be solved if Hitler preempts him and asks for a declaration of war against the United States. And in this period, Roosevelt's getting intelligence as to how Hitler will act. It's slightly conflicting. It's not entirely clear that Nazi Germany will move towards a declaration of a state of war, but that is what Roosevelt believes and what he needs essentially in order for the United States to enter the war united, without any challenges coming from those who believe that the United States can avoid war with Germany. The America Firsters who've been arguing against him for a long time. Roosevelt is certain that if the United States comes in, it has to do so united. So this speech is part of that rhetorical strategy, but it's not the sort of culmination yet of a formal state of war between the United States and Germany.
In your book, Hitler's American Gamble, you separate most of your book into chapters for December 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, leading up, as you say, to the Hitler speech on the 11th. But I want to ask you about a person, Brendan Sims, Oshima. Who was he? And he comes up in your book several times, and what role did he play between December the 6th and December the 11th?
So General Oshima is the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, and he has a pretty critical role because he's one of the people who is tasked with bringing about the agreement between the Japanese Empire, the German Reich, and Mussolini's Italy. Because, of course, prior to Pearl Harbor, there is no formal agreement for a war which has been started by the Japanese or by any other of the Axis powers. They'd been linked through a Tripartite Pact in the autumn of 1940, but that pact was strictly a defensive pact. And so now a new arrangement was needed to knit the three powers together in a situation where a war had taken place, but actually it had been an offensive war, an aggressive war started by Japan. So Oshima is really in the eye of the storm there, passing messages on from Tokyo to the German leadership, particularly to the German Foreign Minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. And we know quite a lot about what he was doing because his communications were being intercepted with several days delay, but were being intercepted by American intelligence. So we have a reasonably good idea of what he was saying. And we also have a good sense of the anxiety on the Japanese side after December the 7th, the first few days after Pearl Harbor, where really Tokyo is concerned that although Hitler has said that he will come in and support them, he may not actually deliver. And of course he had, it must be remembered, he had, for example, stabbed Stalin in the back after concluding a pact with him. So the nightmare scenario for the Japanese on the 7th, 8th, 9th of December was that they would be fighting the British Empire, and particularly the United States, on their own, and Hitler would not come in and support him. So again, you get a real sense of the uncertainty that is swirling around this issue at the time.
Professor Laderman, tell us who ex-champagne salesman Ribbentrop was and what was his relationship to Oshima.
Yes, so he's Hitler's foreign minister and had played a major role in German diplomacy in the 30s into the 40s, had been in London as an ambassador, and in the late 30s helps to negotiate the pact with the Soviet Union that Brendan had just talked about, the one which ultimately Germany would turn around and ultimately rip up when they invaded the Soviet Union. So Ribbentrop is the German foreign minister at this time and is presiding over German diplomacy. And at a time where the nation is at war, diplomacy obviously isn't the first priority, but it's still very important in a world where there are major neutral nations like the United States that aren't involved in the conflict. So Ribbentrop is sort of the point person for the American charge d'affaires in Nazi Germany, because there was no diplomatic representation. The United States had withdrawn its ambassador after Kristallnacht. The Germans didn't have an ambassador in Washington, but there were diplomats from either nation who were interacting with the foreign ministries. And so Ribbentrop is overseeing this, while at the same time, as Brendan says, he's also negotiating with the Japanese and with the Italians for this Tripartite Pact, which ultimately, prior to this, you have this sort of loose agreement between the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, but you don't have a formal agreement that if one of them ends up in a war with the United States where they have preempted it, ultimately Germany would have had to go to war if the United States had attacked Japan. But because it was the other way around, there was no legal obligation on Germany to do so. So Ribbentrop was tasked with turning that sort of informal agreement and that informal pact into a more formal one. And that's what we see over these few days, because so much is still unsettled, and it's requiring the diplomats and the foreign ministers to negotiate a new agreement in a very tight time frame.
Let me ask you both about the process of this book. If I counted it right, there are 1,644 footnotes in 103 pages. Now, anybody that follows books knows that's a lot of work right there. How did you two divide up your responsibilities in writing this book, and how hard was it to sift through those 1,644 footnotes? Start with Professor Sims.
Book, so we as it were, own and have discussed basically every line in it, but we did divide up certain parts of it according to our respective expertises. So Charlie knows particularly about the British side and the American side, and I knew particularly about the German side, and then I also took on the Soviet angle and the Japanese angle. And then we simply, because the book is very much a narrative, a detailed blow by blow, sometimes not only hour by hour, but minute by minute account of proceedings in exact chronological order as best we could establish. That meant that research was quite difficult because we had to find out when certain things had happened or make a best estimate. But it meant that the writing of it was in some ways simplified because we had a strict chronology, at least in the main text chapters, that we were following. And I have to say that despite all the warnings we got, that joint authorship is very difficult and ends in broken friendships, Charlie and I are still talking to each other.
Professor Laderman, give us your take on putting this process of writing this book together.
Yes, as Brendan said, what we were trying to do, because it was so important for us to be able, for any reader to be able to put themselves in the positions of the main protagonists, what we really wanted to be able to do is to capture as much of that period, that very tight time frame as possible. So as you say, that required a lot of reading in the secondary sources. It required a lot of digging in archives around the world in order to really get to the essence of how people were experiencing this period. Both the high statesmen at the top, but one of the things we try and do in the book is to give a sense of what the ordinary person on the street in all of these countries was feeling. So this would require access to diaries, to what was on the radio at this time as well, just to give a sense of what it was like. And so we divided in the way in which Brendan has mentioned. And one of the things that was so difficult, but which was I think what was also enjoyable to try and do, is to try and fit this puzzle together, to try to know what people knew and when they knew it, because of the intelligence intercepts from the British and the Americans, they were able to read a lot of what the Germans and the Japanese were sending to each other. But the question was, when did they know it? How and how complete a picture did that give you? Because a lot of these intercepts were quite fragmentary, and so that was really important to us, is to try and sort of inhabit the minds of people making decisions that ultimately determine the fate of the world.
I'm going to run a minute, and this is dangerous to do on radio because people just hear it will think, "What in the world are we? Why are we doing this?" I'm going to run a minute of the Nazi national anthem that you refer to in here, which is named after, as you all know, a young soldier who was killed at age 22, a German who was a brown shirt, and his name was Horst Wessel. And this is the national anthem. We'll just listen to a minute of it and ask both of you to reflect on what role this kind of thing played in the lead up to his speech on December the 11th. By the way, Joseph Goebbels made a hero out of this guy, and the first 4 lines of this song, flag high, ranks closed. The SA, which were the stormtroopers, marches with silent, solid steps. Comrades shot by the Red Front, those are the communists of Germany, and reaction, march in spirit with us in our ranks. I could go on, but that's the flavor of what the Germans were hearing during that time. Professor Sims, fill in the blanks.
Yes, so he is a figure from the early history of the SA, and he is killed in somewhat controversial circumstances. He seems to have been in some sense a pimp, but he was turned into a martyr by the National Socialist movement. And then this hymn, this song becomes a sort of party anthem and is then played very much at the same time or soon after or before the traditional German national anthem, or at least the one that is then adopted after the German Empire, and of course is the Nazi, the anthem then also under the Nazi period. So you've got these 2 tunes, one Haydn and the other the Horst Wessel lied. And it's intended really to get the party faithful sort of whipped up. And the language of that song is indeed suggestive. You read out a couple of lines. There are other lines towards the end which say, today Germany belongs to us, and tomorrow the whole world. Sometimes also rendered as, today Germany hears us, and tomorrow the whole world will hear us. So in some ways, from the vantage point of 1941, when Germany is about to take on really the whole of the rest of the world, the words of that song must resonate in very interesting and complicated ways.
Charlie Laderman, you can react to that, but also set up what the situation was leading up to the Hitler speech. What was the atmosphere in the United States and in Germany and the rest of the world?
Yes, so the song is sort of part of this sort of pomp and theatricality that Hitler is determined to maintain in the lead up to his speech. So his speech is announced around the world. It's confirmed sort of on the evening of the 10th of December. And this announcement that Hitler will speak at 3 p.m. in Germany. And the idea of that is that he would be speaking at that time, not just to Germany, but to the whole world, that the Japanese will be able to hear this before they go to bed, and that the Americans will be able to hear this when they wake up. And so Hitler chooses that time very consciously. What's clear is that even with that announcement that he will address the Reichstag, it's not necessarily clear to everyone that he's going to move to a declaration of a state of war. It still could be the case that he just declares his affinity, his support for the Japanese, but doesn't formally declare war. And so if you look at the American newspapers, the British newspapers on the morning of December the 11th, there's still some sense of that this could be a sort of a limited speech. It may not be the sort of confirmation of a formal state of war that it might seem. So Hitler giving this speech at 3 p.m. So there's this sort of this looming threat, but at the same time there's this sort of like farce about it as well. So Hitler is preparing to give his speech. Mussolini is also wanting to declare war on the United States and to sort of give his own sort of take on this. And there's all these challenges going on between the Germans and the Italians as to who is going to declare war first. The Hitler and the Germans don't want Mussolini to preempt him. Mussolini is determined to get his words in. And ultimately, actually, Mussolini does declare war ahead of Hitler. And this is sort of recognized around the world, this sort of farcical sense of the two sort of self-proclaimed strongmen trying to sort of outbid each other in order to be the ones to be the first to declare war on the United States.
Professor Sims, in your book, you say Hitler's announcement of war on the U.S. is considered an inexplicable strategic blunder. Why?
Well, on the face of it, you would have to ask yourself, given that you are already, if you're Hitler, engaged in a really difficult conflict with the British Empire, which he is not winning, stalemated. He's just run into the ground before Moscow on the Eastern Front. Why? And given also that, as we were talking about earlier on, he in fact has a very healthy respect for US power. Why on earth would he engage in an act that would then seem suicidal and in fact turned out to be suicidal, because we know how this ends? And the answer is, it's precisely because he has such a fear of US power and because he believes that President Roosevelt is trying to bring the United States into the war against him, and because he thinks that actually Roosevelt is going to succeed, because he fears that the Japanese will go down to defeat, and because he thinks he really only has without his intervention, and therefore he really only has a very small window of opportunity to crush the Soviet Union, or at least to push Stalin further away, to stalemate the British, and then to basically dig in on the continent of Europe, using the grain and raw materials of the Soviet Union to outlast the Anglo-American blockade. That's a pretty narrow path to victory, or at least to some kind of compromised peace. But it's the only path he can see. And that's why he determines to seize the initiative, as he would regard it. And he says quite explicitly, I'm not going to allow the Americans to declare war on me like President Wilson did in the First World War. I'm going to preempt them. I will maintain the initiative here. So that's how that paradox is resolved.
Professor Laderman, I looked up the speech. It's long, it's dense. But my question, do you happen to know who wrote it?
It's a good question. Hitler himself is sort of poring over it in the days leading up to it, and it's part of the way that things then ultimately get pushed back. And one of the reasons why there's such uncertainty is that at one point Hitler's going to be giving this speech on the 10th of December. It ultimately isn't ready, so he ultimately decides to push that back in order to make sure that this set piece speech does everything that he wants it to do. But he also has diplomats in the German Foreign Office sort of preparing the sort of the fulminations that he's going to be directing against the United States. They go back over all of Roosevelt's speeches, going back to 1937 and that quarantine speech, to say this is this sort of unconstrained hostility that the United States has had against us, and this is what has sort of directed us towards this conflict. So it's Hitler sort of provides the sort of essence, and it's sort of the essence of his worldview, but it's sort of being supplied by diplomats in terms of the fodder for it. But Brendan might be able to fill in a bit more of the detail on that.
No, that's exactly right. So I mean, Hitler writes his own speeches, but he does have a lot of input, first of all, from German diplomats, as Charlie was saying, but also from Goebbels. And in fact, he spends quite a lot of the period between the 7th and the 11th actually preparing his speech. This is really the most important thing going on for him at the time, in some ways more important than the crises on the Eastern Front, for example. He's totally focused on this political and rhetorical sort of high point, culmination of his career. I mean, almost basically his entire worldview is now being vindicated, as he sees it, in this conflict, which takes the German Reich into open war with the ultimate enemy being the United States, the great industrial power, the great capitalist power, the plutocratic power, the power which is so strong racially, as Charlie said earlier, because it has, in his view, these really powerful Anglo-Saxon and Germanic elements, but also a power which, in his view, has been subverted by the manipulations and machinations of international Jewry. And so he spent an inordinate amount of time preparing this speech because it's so important to him.
I'm going to read back to you your summary of what was in this speech, 4 points, and have you both comment on any one of them. 1, the supposed power of international Jewry. 2, the evil of plutocracy. 3, the hostility of Roosevelt. And 4, centrality of race and space. And let me ask somebody, what does it mean, centrality of race and space?
Well, Hitler sees race and space as intimately related. So his explanation of world history and his explanation for the fact that the German Reich is in such a disadvantageous position in the mid-20th century is that the Anglo-Saxons have basically walked off with the most desirable parts of the world. They control, in the case of the British Empire, obviously, that huge territory, and in the case of the United States, which he regards as an Anglo-Saxon power, of course, the vast expanse of the territorial United States. And Hitler's argument is that, therefore, the British and the Americans are able to develop their true racial qualities because they've got space within which they can unfold, they have resources on which they can draw. By contrast, in Hitler's view, the German Reich is territorially highly constricted. It is unable to feed its burgeoning population. And then that population emigrates, as Charlie said at the beginning of our conversation, and in fact fertilizes. This is the word, the exact word that Hitler uses. The Germans fertilize Anglo-America. So bringing race and space into the right relationship with each other, in other words, by capturing in European Russia the living space, the Lebensraum, necessary in his view for the development of the German race. That's absolutely critical to Hitler's project.
Just a reminder to our listeners that Professor Sims is in his office at Cambridge in Great Britain, just north of London, and our other guest, co-author of this book, Charlie Laderman, is at Stanford at the Hoover Institution. Professor Laderman, the hostility of Roosevelt.
Yes, so ultimately, Hitler sees a lot of these things as being interconnected. So for Roosevelt, there's this sense that Roosevelt has been pushing towards a state of war with Germany ever since 1937. And so Hitler sees this sort of looming challenge that's being posed by the United States. I think what's important to say is that if you're sitting in London in the lead up to December 1941, there's by no means a sense of inexorability that the United States is going to enter into this war in a formal sense. So this is one of the things that's so important that we try to show in the book, is it depends where you're sitting, and it depends where you are for how the world looks at this period. Is the war going to be inevitable or is it not? So from Hitler's perspective, it certainly is inevitable. And as Brendan said, that's why he believes he needs to preempt Roosevelt, but that he also needs to do so in such a way that, that there's this sort of very limited time frame where he can strike and ultimately build the barricades under which he might be able to survive an American onslaught. So there's the hostility of Roosevelt, but the other aspects are also connected as well. So from Hitler's perspective, he believes that Roosevelt is sort of the puppet of international Jewry. He's been stating for years that sort of the heart of Hitler's radically anti-Semitic worldview is this belief that international Jewry, this conspiracy that underlies the major powers. The Jewry is behind the enemies of Germany and are manipulating the United States into war with Nazi Germany. Now, of course, you've been saying also alongside this, ever since the late 1930s, that if a world war was to come, and as his conception of this, a world war would be a war with the United States. But if a world war was to come, it would lead to the destruction of international Jewry. And obviously, for someone with such a radically anti-Semitic worldview, the sense is that these things are sort of inexorably going to happen. There's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy in Hitler's mind if the World War comes, which obviously ultimately he brings about by his declaration of war on the United States in order to bring in the most powerful neutral nation, the most powerful industrial nation into this conflict. So ultimately, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that he ultimately, after this, will escalate the genocide that he has already been perpetrating against European Jewry, accelerates the Holocaust in the final solution. So for him, these things are interlinked, and it ultimately leads to to sort of this escalation, this acceleration of the worst crimes of Nazi Germany.
Professor Sims, I find this statistic, I guess one way it's sad, I want you to comment on it, that in 1941 there are 17 million Jews in the world. Today there are 15 million Jews in the world. They still haven't come back to that level that they were then. What does that say to you?
Well, it's a reminder of the terrible crime perpetrated by Hitler's Germany against European Jewry, which was justified in his mind, and we stress in his mind only, by his belief, as Charlie outlined, that so-called international Jewry was behind an international conspiracy against him. And one of the things we show in the book is that the day after Hitler's declaration of war, on the 11th of December, he proceeds on the 12th of December with a meeting which he summoned a few days earlier of the Nazi political leadership. And he says, roughly speaking, I warned the Jews, inverted commas, a couple of years ago that if we have another world war, and world war means war with the United States, then they will pay the price. Well, now we have the world war, he says, and now they must suffer. So there's a very direct connection made in his mind between the contest with the United States and the murder of the remaining Jews, bearing in mind that 1 million or at least had already been murdered, the remaining Jews on the European continent. And so the figure you cited just now reflects that awful legacy.
One of the other things that you said was a theme of his speech, and I'll just throw in this background. You can get online and look at who the richest countries in the world are, and one of them that caught my eye, depending on how you figure this, the United States is either number 1 or number 2, Germany is number 3, and Japan is number 8. So he saw the world as the evil of plutocracy, and now today Germany, after all this, sits there being somewhat protected by the United States, and they're rich. Either one of you.
That's a great irony, if I may start off, and one of which the Germans are also very conscious. And we see this much discussed today, of course, in the context of the Ukrainian crisis, where the Germans have been very backward, according to their critics, with coming up with collective security solutions for Europe, and have been regarded as being really far too lenient towards the Russia of Vladimir Putin, while at the same time the Anglo-Americans, and particularly, of course, the United States, are the ones who are bearing the burden of the common defense. So there is still a lot of, I think, legacy from the Second World War, because all of this is justified and can be explained by the enduring trauma that this war causes, also for the German people, about the legitimate use of force. And all of that goes back, of course, to the experience of the Second World War.
Professor Sims, because you have to leave, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll have a few more minutes with Professor Laderman. One of the things in the book that has said Hitler's greatest blunder was losing to the Russians. How did he lose to the Russians, and why did he break the pact that they had back in 39?
Well, he breaks the pact with the Russians because of the war with the British Empire. He outlines this very clearly in the lead up to Operation Barbarossa, which begins, of course, on the 22nd of June 1941. And his argument is the following. He says that, first of all, the British are continuing in the hope of having the Soviet Union join in, so we must take that hope from them. Secondly, in order to outlast the British blockade, we need the food and raw material resources of the Soviet Union. And thirdly, we need to sort out the Soviet Union before the United States comes in. And finally, having dispatched the Soviet Union, Roosevelt might be less likely to come in. So that's the motivation behind the attack. It's really part of his overall war with Anglo-America. It isn't, in the first instance, the product of his anti-Bolshevist sentiment, important though that is. But what's really driving it is the conflict with Anglo-America. Then, of course, he underestimates the Soviet Union. And after early successes in the summer and autumn of 1941, he is, before Moscow, at the beginning of December of 41, running into trouble. But what's always interesting, and this is something we stress in the book, is that even in that situation, his main concern is the British and the Americans, particularly the Americans. He doesn't really take on board the magnitude of the crisis before Moscow until a couple of weeks later, when he imposes the famous halt order and says, no step back. So while the Eastern Front is important, and losing it was obviously pretty catastrophic, our argument basically is that needs to be seen in proportion to, in fact, the greater threat posed both in Hitler's imaginary, but also in reality, given the industrial power of Anglo-America, by the British Empire and by the United States.
Professor Brendan Sims at Cambridge, thank you very much. We'll let you go. I know you have another meeting to go to, and thanks for joining us, and I'm going to hold on to Professor Laderman for a couple more minutes.
Thank you very much.
So go to Professor Laderman with a question. What was the Tripartite Pact, and what relationship did that have to all this?
Yeah, so going back to 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan had been moving towards a more sort of formal agreement in terms of their hostility to the United States in particular, this possibility of the United States entering into the war. There'd been this long-standing sort of loose collaboration between what we describe as, or what Hitler certainly uses the term of the have-not powers, this sense that these powers that are sort of revanchist powers looking to upset the international system, who believe that the world has been ordered in such a way where the British Empire and the United States are the dominant powers in the world, and they're trying to carve out their own places in the sun. So they are moving sort of towards a looser collaboration, but ultimately they start to move towards a more formal agreement, which is in part directed against the Soviet Union, certainly after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, but also even more so against the United States and the British Empire. And what we see within this is this sense where Hitler, because he doesn't want to see Japan go down to defeat on its own against the United States, he needs to keep the United States distracted from affairs in Europe so that he can dispense with the Soviet Union as he sees it. Ultimately, Hitler has pledged that Germany would join in any war that Japan launches against the United States, even though he isn't under treaty obligation to do so unless another power attacks Japan, not if Japan launches that conflict itself. And the big question of the Tripartite Pact for those who are looking at it from the outside, for the British and the Americans, is, can you trust Hitler's word? He might have pledged this, and the British and Americans are aware that he has pledged this, but can you believe what Hitler will do? Will he, as Roosevelt's speechwriter Robert Sherwood says at the time, will Hitler allow such bourgeois sentiments as sort of legal niceties and diplomatic agreements to guard his action. Because as we know in the past, Hitler has often reversed himself. There's no clear indication that Hitler will follow through on his word. But that's sort of at the heart of this discussion. Can you trust Hitler's word, and will this lead to this formal pact agreement with Japan in order to take on the United States?
You know, as I'm reading your book, and when we're recording this, it's right in the middle of the confrontation that Mr. Putin has put up against Ukraine. I kept seeing the same pattern. I know it's not the same at the moment. It's not the same, it's not as large, but do you have any sense that as you listen through the discussion on Ukraine that there is a similarity in what happens behind the scenes among the diplomats?
I think there are certainly similarities in terms of statesmen having to make decisions where they have in extraordinarily compressed timeframes, but also they're doing this where they have really incomplete pictures of how the other side is going to act. Even in an age of sort of hyper communications that we have today, even though the intelligence that we have on competitors, there's still a very incomplete picture. And so statesmen are having to make these decisions without knowing all the things that we know when we look back on them. But also, I think what's fascinating is the way in which the United States, again, is facing the possibility of conflicts on both sides of the Eurasian landmass, this possibility of a conflict in Eastern Europe with Russia and the challenge that it poses to Ukraine, but at the same time, the challenge posed by China and potentially to Taiwan. And a lot of analysts talking about the interrelationship between the two. And we see the same thing in 1941. Where should the United States focus its attention? Should it be on East Asia? Should it be on Europe? Does the United States have the capacity to fight or in order to deter war in both places? And I think it's one of the other things that's important to us. Obviously, we know that the United States enters into the Second World War and is able to fight these massive conflicts in both East Asia and in Europe. But that wasn't clear at the time. It wasn't clear that the United States necessarily had the industrial base in order to do this. There was a limited amount of supplies that the United States was giving to the British and the Soviets, and which it would have left over for itself as well. So these were big questions at the time. And a lot of the people who were America firsters and opposed to the war with Germany were also believers that the United States should ultimately focus on the Pacific once the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor. They become Pacific firsters. And these big questions about can the United States basically sustain struggles in Europe and in East Asia? Where should the focus be? Is the main challenge coming from East Asia, or is it coming from Western Europe? In terms of the challenge that's being posed there, these are similar questions, even if the regimes are obviously very different. But the strategic questions and the dilemmas that statesmen face are quite similar to those that we saw in 1941.
We can wrap this up, but before we do, of all the people you wrote about and thought about during this preparation for this book, who was the smartest?
That's an excellent question. It was, I think I came away from this with even more of a fascination about Franklin Roosevelt. He really is a fascinating figure, and a fascinating figure for historians to try to understand, because he doesn't reveal that much of himself. Even those of his closest aides, they don't know what's going on as the inner workings of his mind. Does he believe prior to December 1941 that the United States should formally enter into this war? That is still unclear to historians. It was unclear to his advisors at the time. And I think what's fascinating about this is the way in which Roosevelt, in an extremely stressful situation, is able to sort of navigate and maintain the strategy that he has in mind in terms of this focus on Germany, even while the United States is faced with a war with Japan. So he's having to juggle all manner of different things, the domestic political situation in the United States, where there's a great deal of opposition to him and the possibility of a war in Europe, while also trying to ensure that the United States is still supporting the British and the Soviet Unions during against Nazi Germany. So he's having to navigate this, and it's a very, very complex situation. And ultimately, I think the way in which he escalates the rhetorical clash with Hitler, leads Hitler to ultimately fall into, certainly as some analysts saw at the time, an element of a trap, that ultimately that Hitler preempts this conflict in the belief that if he doesn't, then the United States will join the war at a time of its own choosing, whereas Roosevelt is still concerned about the domestic sense and believes that only the unity that would come from Germany preempting the conflict will bring about the United States entering the war in an undivided way. So it's a very complex situation, and the way in which Roosevelt navigates it is fascinating to look back on.
The name of the book is Hitler's American Gamble, Pearl Harbor and Germany's March to Global War. Our guests have been Brendan Sims and Professor Charlie Laderman, who is currently out at Stanford, but headquarters in King's College in London. And we thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for listening. Please rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.